What's up, sports fans? My name is lukasweese, host of the Weesesports Chronicles podcast. We got a great episode for you today with Dan Rosen. He's a senior writer for NHL.com. In this episode, I chat with Dan about a plethora of topics, from reporting on the Stanley Cup Playoffs to interviewing players via Zoom, as well as his sports media career and the future of hockey reporting after the pandemic is over. The Weesports Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to today's episode with Dan Rosen on the Weesports Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Chronicles, I am pleased to be joined by Dan Rosen. He's a senior writer for NHL.com. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and we're recording this episode on Friday with only two first-round series left, the Montreal Canadiens and the Philadelphia Flyers and the Vancouver Canucks, the St. Louis Blues. But, Dan, does it feel weird with just only two hockey games left, given all the hockey that we've had these last few weeks?
Yeah, but it's also something that we've got to kind of get used to now, right? I mean, we've had 24 teams, and that got whittled down to 16, and now we're going to get it whittled down to 8 here. By the time this airs, we'll be down there. So we got to get used to a little bit less hockey, but it has been a lot of fun to have all the hockey we've had. And that to me is why the first round of the Stanley Cup Playoffs every year is always the best to me, because you've got 16 teams playing, you've got so much going on, 8 series going on, and there's news stories flying left and right and all that, and so much intrigue. And if you cover the entire league or you're a fan of the entire league, it just captivates you. It really does. Now we're going to get down to the nitty gritty. Now we're going to get down to start whittling these teams out, and the best of the best rises up. And then you really get deep into a series, into the coverage of a series now. So a little bit less games, but each game takes on obviously so much more meaning.
Of course, and we went 3 months without any live sports on here in North America, except for charity golf matches. So I think we'll take it. But I just wanted to ask you, Dan, right off the top, how you're a senior writer with NHL.com, as I said, covering the whole league. But given just the changes of reporting on the Stanley Cup playoffs, how has your job changed now compared to, let's say, a year ago when travel was normal, things were normal, and journalists were traveling back and forth covering different series?
Yeah, it's changed tremendously. It's completely different. It's very odd. It's weird for me to be doing it this way. Just in terms of personally, like in between periods, instead of chatting with colleagues and maybe grabbing a cup of tea or coffee or water or something like that, and just talking about the game, I'm doing dishes, or I'm folding laundry or whatever it may be, so it's obviously very different. In games I'm covering, I'm not necessarily doing those things, but in the games I'm just watching, I am doing those things. So it's very different. Professionally, you're not getting as much information. I mean, you're just not, and it's understandable. It's hard to do. It's hard to cover these games and these series like you do when you're in person, when you get an opportunity to go into the locker room and sit down with a couple of players. And if player A, player B, and player C are over there talking to somebody else, you can go talk to player D and get, information that maybe nobody else is getting. Heads up, insight, whatever it may be. You can't do that now. You're limited to the Zoom availabilities, post-game, pre-game, on-off days. So you don't really get to choose who you want to talk to, and a lot of times you can at least pick and choose for base guys on who's in the locker room. They're getting, the Zoom availabilities aren't very long, and I understand that. They do have to cut it off at a certain point. So it's quite different. You can't really dig in your heels and get into something deep with a player or a coach, because you're not there in person. And also, just not being there in person, you're not catching all the other little details of the games that you would if you were just sitting in the press box and watching and getting the above view. And people say, well, what does that matter? And to me, it does. It does matter because you see things that happen behind the play that maybe nobody else catches, and you do. And you can ask somebody about that, and it becomes a story, or it becomes a storyline, or something to watch. And you're not getting all that. But that's the time we're living in right now, so you can't really complain about any of it.
No, for sure. And you mentioned 2 points that I find interesting. I think just the whole Zoom thing and not having those one-on-one conversations, because those are where the really good stories happen. Like the stories that not everyone's reporting on that you do, just because you do the work and are willing to talk to anyone and get a quote that no one else can. That just can't happen anymore because you only get a select group of players on the Zoom calls. And another thing you just mentioned is about being at the rink and noticing that compared to now where, Dan, you can access any Zoom call of any series. So how do you sort of limit the focus? Like, are you covering one series, or are you just trying to figure out what's the good story every night and picking it from there?
Well, no, the way we have it assigned at NHL.com is we get a series. So right now, as we talk, I've been covering the Vancouver St. Louis series, and in the qualifying round, I covered the Rangers Carolina series. And then you jump around a little bit. I jumped around a little bit in the qualifying round. I did a couple of the round robin games. I did an Islanders Panthers game. But the focus specific was to Carolina and the Rangers. And this one, the focus has been specific to St. Louis and Vancouver. Next round, in the second round, my focus is going to be specific to Dallas and Colorado, which is good. You're bouncing around. You're seeing different teams. You're not getting stuck with one team, your mind goes to certain storylines when you're on a series the whole way. So moving to a new series with 2 new teams, you get a fresh look. And I think that actually enhances the coverage like we have. We have a number of different writers, but if everybody can get a fresh look in a different round, I think it makes the stories better. I think it makes the storylines better because you're seeing things that the other person might not have seen before. So I like the fact that I get a series, and that's how it is in normal times too. I will be latched onto one series and traveling between those 2 cities. And a lot of times you stick with the winner of that series. It doesn't always happen, but this time you're latched on it at home, and now I'm going to bounce to a new series. So it does give you a fresh perspective at least.
And do you think, Dan, that your just prior experience in the industry, the relationships that you've built over the years working and covering hockey have helped you during these times where you can't be at the rink and you can't, you're trying to grasp for any sort of story that's unique?
100%. And I'll give you a really good example of it. So the best type of stuff you can get is if you get it, in my opinion, if you talk to somebody who nobody else is talking to. Mm-hmm. So in this scenario, that's impossible unless you go outside the bubble, right? I mean, you're not going to another guy in the locker room that nobody's talking to at that present time to just do a one-on-one. Everything is over Zoom. Anybody can access it, which is by the way, the ability to access any of these press conferences is good for somebody that covers the whole league. I don't get that opportunity if I'm in a series on normal times. You're on your series. Now you can really gauge what's going on everywhere around the league. So that is a positive to this. But I'll give you an example. So earlier this week, I did a story on Bo Horvat from the Vancouver Canucks. And I said, well, I got to get somebody outside the bubble. And so I talked to a colleague of mine who was able to give me the contact information for Henrik Sedin. And Henrik Sedin, and I know him. We go back to, a decade or more from when he was in the league and when I started covering the NHL. And so we have a relationship in that sense. We're not buddies or anything, but he knows me and I know him. And so when I was able to text him, he wrote back and said, let's chat. Sure. And he gave me perspective on Bo Horvat for a story I did that I don't think anybody else had. And it didn't make the story that much better than anybody else would write. I mean, that's not for me to judge, but it was different than what you would normally get in the bubble. So those are the types of contacts you need to utilize to get different stuff, to get more, a different readership, to be different from the other person on the Zoom call. And that's the goal here. And, we've done it, other writers that I work with have done it. We're working on a story on Miro Heiskanen. So do we want to just talk to Miro Heiskanen? No, we maybe you can get, Scott Stevens or Brian Leetch or Scott Niedermayer or former defenseman Sergei Zubov or somebody like that to give a perspective on a player, but they're not in the bubble, and nobody else may be reaching out to them.
And I guess this will be really put to the test, Dan, during the Stanley Cup Final, where everyone is covering those two series, that one series and those two teams, where you really need to put that to the test of thinking outside the box.
Absolutely. And I think back, actually, it was 5 years ago, the 2015 Stanley Cup Final. I remember it well because my role at that Stanley Cup Final was to cover what was going on in the arena, but get perspective from outside the arena. And that was Tampa Bay and Chicago. So I remember doing a story on Duncan Keith where I talked to Nicholas Lidstrom and Brian Leetch, because former NHL defensemen, Hall of Fame players, and you needed a different perspective from them to really gauge on what Duncan Keith was doing. And that was my job. So almost every day, if not every other day, I was reaching out to contacts made, from years of covering the NHL to help me in covering that series. And I think that is what could be going on come the Stanley Cup Final. This time it's very important, super important, most important, in fact, to cover what's going on inside the bubble in this case, and what's going on with the two teams, but to augment or supplement your coverage with some outside voices, outside opinions, I think is, serves the reader well because it gives them a different look and makes what you're writing different, again, like I said, from the next guy. So, and that's the goal. That's what you want.
Speaking of Vancouver, St. Louis, you said that you were covering this series, and I think it's been the most exciting first-round series. It's had everything. It's been really, really exciting from both ends. Regardless of what happens, Dan, to the Vancouver Canucks, what has impressed you about this team, particularly when a lot of these guys are so young and haven't had playoff experience yet?
Well, what's impressed me is how they've stood in there toe-to-toe with the defending Stanley Cup champions. What impressed me was how they came back from not a good performance in Game 1 against the Minnesota Wild in the qualifying round and were able to win the next 3 games to win the series. What's impressed me is Jacob Markstrom. He's never played in the playoffs before. He's a playoff goaltender. There's no question about it. As we're talking, Vancouver, is hours away from playing for the 6-game series win. What impressed me was how they came back in Game 5 because I thought they were done. I shouldn't say that. I didn't think they were done. I knew they had it in them, but the way it was going, the way they lost Game 4, they lose in overtime in Game 3. The way you lose in Game 4, they were just caved in possession-wise, just dominated in that game. And then the first period plus of Game 5, it looked like the same thing. It's 3-1. The Blues are rolling. The defending Stanley Cup champs are back. Here they are. And then Vancouver turned it, and they scored 3 goals in less than 7 minutes to take a 4-3 lead. And then so impressive, the third period, how they locked it in, and Markstrom made some great saves. But that's a young team growing up before our eyes. 10 guys who had never played in the Stanley Cup playoffs before are now going toe-to-toe with the defending Stanley Cup champion. So they've been very impressive to me. And Quinn Hughes, I watch the Canucks a lot, even being on the East Coast. I do like to watch the Canucks a lot because I think they're an exciting team to watch. And Quinn Hughes is just standing out in these playoffs. He has been so good, so dynamic. And if you're watching the games, you're really getting a look at what the future of the NHL defensemen look like.
Well, when you look at a guy like Quinn Hughes, he's so effective, of course, on the power play. He always makes that, really nice pass. When you look at his expected goals with or without him on the ice, like the Vancouver Canucks, are way better with him on the ice in terms of generating scoring chances. And of course, that great play in Game 2, setting up the Bo Horvat OT winner, that bank pass. And again, like he's just a kid. Like he's only, he's so young, and this is his first playoff. So really nice to see that growth from such a young defenseman who's really captivating the headlines.
Absolutely. And I loved his comment. I think it was after Game 2. And you're right, the pass to Bo Horvat and the look at Tyler Bozak after Bo Horvat scored the goal. I love that. That was great. But his comment after that game was, it's an honor that they're focusing on me and they're keying in on me. And that is exactly the attitude you want to see from a young stud player like Quinn Hughes. who, they are focusing on him. They were trying to chip him, hit him, do whatever they possibly could to knock him off his game, and it wasn't working. And he called it an honor that they would even try to do that to him. So I like that. I like that moxie that he has. There's no question about it. His first pass is terrific. His skill at the point on the power play, the way he runs it and quarterbacks the power play, is really just remarkable. He is so young, and the future, his future is so bright. And the one thing is, and people will look at the Vancouver Canucks, and rightfully so, that they have cap implications that they're going to have to deal with in the offseason. And the flat cap does hurt them, but their core is Pettersson, Hughes. They have two guys at two of the best players in the league at the most important positions in the league, and they're both very young. So that's good.
I know that there's still two teams that need to advance to the second round to make it full, but of the teams that have advanced so far, which one has stood out to you just in terms of having the best chance to win it all in these strange circumstances?
Well, there's a couple, but obviously you have to be, focused and enamored with what the Colorado Avalanche have done. I picked the Avalanche to come out of the Western Conference and to play in the Stanley Cup Final. I like that pick still. The question that I have, and it's got to be answered, and I can't answer it now, is when they get into a heavy series, if they get past Dallas and they play a Vegas, right, and they get into a heavy series, is Colorado going to be able to play that heavy style of hockey and still win? I think they can. Part of the reason is I think their defense is really strong and big and physical, and they can do those types of things. And McKinnon can play any style of hockey. You ask him to, so can Rantanen, so can Landeskog, so can Kadri for that matter, and Burakovsky. So I think they can, but we got to see it because they're such a speed and skill team. But Colorado's really impressed me. I think Vegas is terrific. But on the East, I picked a team to win the Stanley Cup, and I'm sticking with it. It's Tampa Bay Lightning. The way they were able to come out of that Columbus series and how they had to win those games in that Columbus series speaks volumes for how far the Tampa Bay Lightning have come. They are a legitimate Stanley Cup threat now. When they went into the playoffs last year, they were the best team in the league in the regular season based on their speed and skill and their goaltending. But when they got into a snarly series, they backed off, they got frustrated, and it didn't work out, right? And they didn't have Victor Hedman, and that hurt. But they made some additions both in the offseason and at the trade deadline. Pat Maroon, Barclay Gaudreau, Blake Coleman, Zach Bogosian, those types of players. And that snarl is back. They can play that style, and they can beat you with their skill. I think they're so dangerous.
Yeah, you can just see John Cooper after the handshake line with the big fist pump. Like, he wanted that revenge on Columbus. But, you look out west, and I agree with you with Vegas and Colorado. And I know that a lot of my listeners are Leaf fans. You got to be you've seen Nazem Kadri do so well at just giving him nightmares about what could have been if he stayed in Toronto. And then you look at Vegas, they have more playoff series wins than the Leafs do in the last few years. So it's a little bit hard, but just two great teams. And hopefully, we'll see what happens. But that Western Conference Final, a Colorado-Vegas matchup could be great.
Yeah, and look, and I understand the Nazem Kadri narrative in Toronto right now. I get it. That trade didn't work out, or it doesn't look like it worked out at all for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But Kadri's playing a different role in Colorado than he would have been playing, in Toronto. So I think that needs to be pointed out. If he was in Toronto, would he be Kerfoot?
Yeah, he'd be a third-line center.
Right? And that's what they got. They got Kerfoot, who's a third-line center. So, and they got Barry, who obviously, I don't think he'll be back, and it wasn't a great season for Tyson Barrie, but he'd be a third-line center. He's not playing above Austin Matthews or John Tavares. It's just not going to happen. So in Colorado, they desperately needed a Nazem Kadri to play second-line center, and it changes how you play the game. Kadri, I'm not surprised by the impact he's making in Colorado. I don't think any Leafs fans should be surprised by the impact he's making. In fact, I think Kyle Dubas and Brendan Shanahan knew what they were giving up, but it had to fit their roster the right way. They had to do their depth chart the right way. And Nazem Kadri playing third-line center is not going to give you the same Nazem Kadri playing second-line center. It's just not going to happen because you're playing with better players.
What a rational answer, Dan. I wish the Leafs had more rationality.
I apologize for trying to bring some rationality to Toronto. I appreciate it. I apologize.
Shifting gears a little bit, and I really am interested in your career and being in sports media. You of course are representing your alma mater well with the Arizona Wildcats.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, was this always in the cards for you, wanting to get involved in sports media?
Yeah, I went to the University of Arizona and because I wanted to go to a big school that had big-time athletics. I didn't know it would lead me necessarily to sports media or what form of media it would lead me to, whether it be broadcasting or the written form or radio, whatever. I wasn't sure. Behind the scenes, I wasn't sure at that time. But that's why I went to the University of Arizona, because I wanted to be in sports and I wanted to work at I wanted to go to a big-time campus that big-time sports, because I knew I could get involved in it if I really pushed. And that's what I did. And I covered sports for the Arizona Daily Wildcat, which is the student newspaper there, a 5-day-a-week, top quality college student newspaper. And I covered the football team and the baseball team and the basketball team. And I was sports editor, and I did a little of the club hockey team and all that stuff. And that's when I knew that I wanted to get into the writing. I wanted to get into the journalism, the reporting of it. And I did. And I worked in newspapers for 7 years after getting out of college, 7.5 years after getting out of college. And then I was able to land a job at the NHL in 2007. It's different than a newspaper. Newspapers are more independent. I work for the National Hockey League. That's who pays my paychecks. So, NHL.com is not a newspaper, but we have grown to, I think, a point in my tenure there, and I got there in 2007, to where we are considered media, and we have a lot of interesting stories on the site where there are still some limitations of what we can do because we work for the league, and look, that's the case. But I don't look at them as limitations. I just look at them as, guidelines, and we're still churning out terrific copy every day. We have a stable of writers that all have the same type of backgrounds as me, and we're all asking questions. We're all digging for information. We're doing the reporting. We're doing the journalism stuff, and we are producing, I think, what a top quality hockey website every single day. It just so happens that it is an arm of the National Hockey League.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you went there in 2007, because that was, social media was sort of, it did exist then, but it wasn't as like it is now, right? Like it was, people were like, what's Facebook? What's Twitter? Like what's tweeting and all that stuff. So I'm just curious, what were the early challenges when you got to NHL.com? Because I'm assuming there were just challenges to just build the brand and the digital side of the website, where it just wasn't as popular as it is now.
Of course. It actually goes back to a couple of years before I got to NHL.com. I was working for the Bergen Record in Northern New Jersey newspaper. I was covering a lot of high school sports, plus doing some Devils and Rangers coverage. And we came up with a blog, and blogs at that time were huge, right? Everybody had blogs were becoming huge at that time. And we came up with a blog called the Varsity Aces. So we covered high school sports, and this is where it was basically, here's where you put all the other information that you get that can't fit in the newspaper, because in the newspaper, you only have an amount of print that you can go with, right? And I remember talking to my boss at the time and a colleague of mine who was a close friend, and we were all saying, it's becoming, at this point, if you're not multimedia, you're going to get phased out. And the blogs were the multimedia. And once I got to the NHL, we did a lot of features. It was very much a feature writing factory at the time. But social media started to pick up. Twitter started to come into play. Podcasts started to come into play. And it became a thing where, if you're not multimedia, you're going to get phased out. So when Twitter started to come in, Twitter is now an arm of the job. Like it's like a limb attached to me. You need it. It's up all the time, right? I'm checking it all the time. It's such an important part of the job. Podcasting. We finally are doing a podcast this year, the At the Rink podcast, and it's been a smashing success. And I think people are interested in it. And we've been pushing to do that for a number of years, but that's becoming a very popular medium. Or is a very popular medium. Everybody's got a podcast now, right? So,
of course.
and people watch, and because the more content that you have in different areas, the better it will be. Fans want content. That's what they want. I want it as a fan of other sports. I want content. And the more you can give them, the better it is. The more multimedia that you are, the better you are. And that goes back now 15 years that I think about that, back to starting that blog when I was covering high school sports. Like, you got to be multimedia and you got to roll with the times. So when I got to NHL.com, it was different. There's no question about it. It was very different. But as the social media world picked up, we had to ride the wave with it. And I think we've done so successfully, and we continue to do so because it's ever changing. It really, and what we know now is going to be different from what we know 2 years from now.
Yeah, and I think you speak to a little bit just the limitations of the newspaper, right? Because
Yes.
you're so bogged down by words and deadlines and word count, whereas on these digital platforms, you have more freedom to perhaps do a feature on a story, and you're not necessarily bogged down by those deadlines. So I guess for you and for a lot of people that work in digital now, it must be a little bit of breath of fresh air that you have just, within reason, more freedom to just navigate different storylines, and you're not just bogged down by those unnecessary restrictions of the newspaper.
Yeah, there's no question about it. But I still look at it and say there are still deadlines, because if you're not quick with getting the information out there, especially after a game, right? Especially post game, or especially after news breaks, then you're behind. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. You don't want to be behind. And also, I'm a huge fan of the well-written, well-sourced, well-reported 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 word feature that really you can dive in and, take 20 minutes to really dive into that. I'm a huge fan of that. I love writing pieces like that. But on the internet, shorter is better. It is. In a lot of cases, quicker is better, because the attention spans of people are not as good as they were when they were just sitting around having a cup of coffee at their table and reading the newspaper on a Sunday morning. It's different, right? It's just the way it is right now. So if you really captivate an audience at the top, you can write a long feature. But if you don't captivate them at the top of the story, what's the other 1,500 words for, right? That's why it's very important to captivate the audience at the top of the story, and then dive into the other meat part of the story, because now you've got the hook. Now you've got them in. But if you don't ever bring them in, they're not going to get to your meat. Don't bury the lead, is the old saying, right?
No, of course, a huge journalistic tenet right there, and I also think too that there's just different ways of telling stories now, like beyond the feature. Journalists are now integrating video into their stories and analyzing that. Analytics, of course, is such a big part of hockey analysis. So it just shows you now, as a journalist, you have to sort of be, one or two steps ahead to figure out what the market is like, what people want. And you always have to sort of cater to that, because if you don't, you're just not going to get the views on the story, so to speak.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I like the stories that have the video components to them. I do, especially a breakdown of a video component. I enjoy those. I learn from those stories. I like reading stories that weave in analytics to a story, but I like analytics. I appreciate them. I think these added statistics that we have in the game are so valuable to the coverage that we do for the game and how we analyze games now. But I'm not a fan of reading a story based solely on analytics. Yeah. Like I will, you lose me on that. That's me. That's not everybody. That's me, right? But I love a story, and I try to write them this way too, where you're weaving in statistical analysis into a narrative that, still fits what you're trying to write about, still fits your style, which is to tell the human side of the story. If you can weave statistical analysis into that, I think that's a real good way to go. But yeah, I see a lot of these stories now where the video component is involved. It's a breakdown, and it really, you learn something if you really take the time to do it. But that's the key thing. The reader, the audience has to take the time to do it.
In addition to writing and you are more than just you are more than just writing. You do a lot of different things, as you mentioned, podcasting. You're also on TV as well at times, and I'm just curious, what were the challenges initially of getting on TV, considering that you were mainly a writer at first and then moving over to the TV?
Well, I don't know if it was necessarily challenges. It was just opportunity. Really, that's what it was. It was I've always wanted to do more. Like I said, go back to that 15 years ago when we were talking about you got to be multimedia or you're going to get phased out, right? So I've always pushed and wanted to do more. It was just the opportunity to do so. We started doing more video element a number of years ago, probably 10 years ago at NHL.com, online video content, and that sort of carried some momentum and carried into doing some, getting some opportunities to do some TV stuff, especially for the NHL Network. And then I live in New Jersey. I live in northern New Jersey. The NHL Network used to be based in Toronto. Then it moved to Secaucus, New Jersey, which is 25 minutes from my house. And once that move happened, I've gone to them more. I'm able to go into the studio and do a little stuff. I don't overdo it. It's not the biggest part of my job, but if they ask, I go. And, during a regular part of a season, I'll do 1 or 2 spots a week. And, they'll come to me if I'm at Madison Square Garden or wherever I am, maybe on the road doing that stuff. But it had to come from opportunity. And the opportunity came because digitally we started doing more video content at NHL.com because we recognized, like we were just talking about before, having a video component to add to a story really made the package of what you were doing that much better. In this case, it was a video component of me talking and analyzing rather than a video breakdown where you're writing about it.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to the point now, because I know a lot of young journalists who want to break into the industry. It's not like the old days anymore where you can just be a writer and survive. You have to know all of these different facets in order to be a lot more employable. And to me, like I like that. Like I like the opportunity and for journalists to not only see their written work, but also hear them talk about the sport or see them on TV, because it just shows that they're a lot more well-rounded than some people may, think they are.
But the key thing in all of this, especially if you want to be a writer who does other things, is you still got to be able to write. Like you still got to be able to tell a story in the written word and through the limitations sometimes of word count. You have to be able to do it. It's still the number one thing that you have to be able to do. And I say that because if your copy isn't good, if your writing isn't readable, your editor won't appreciate it. The copy editors will complain about it, and the readers are smart enough to notice it. Yeah. And once all that happens, it doesn't matter what you say or where you go on, you're not going to be taken seriously. So you still have to be able to do that number one old school principle of know how to tell a story.
I know it's too early to tell, just given everything that's going on and what happens next season and going forward with the NHL. But do you think, Dan, that there will be certain components of the coverage now, Zoom calls, let's say, et cetera, that will be implemented down the road, like will be sort of implemented down the road full time, like for people that, their companies may not send media members to different events in the NHL? Do you think that'll be implemented, or do you think like eventually we'll get back to normal where journalists are traveling and it's sort of like what it was pre-pandemic?
Right. I hope this isn't the new normal for us. Yeah. I really do. This is, I don't know, obviously, but I think, or maybe it's just the optimist in me, I do think that once we are as a society in a different place, our jobs in media will get back to normal, because part of me says that because I think the coaches and the players and the general managers and the executives also want it that way. That it has to be very strange for a coach to sit in a room and hear a voice coming at them and have to answer a question. As much as coaches and players will say, oh, I got to do this now, or I'm not so sure I want to do the media, or they're careful or tight-lipped about what they're saying, there's a give and take that they enjoy. And there's a personable aspect to all this that they enjoy. And there's also the idea of if you write something about somebody or you say something about somebody, showing up the next day and facing that person.
Yeah.
You can't do that right now. You can't do that. I think of Austin Matthews.
Yep.
Remember what he said to Steve Simmons? He didn't like what Steve Simmons wrote. That's Austin Matthews. And he made it a point of saying it on a Zoom call. He probably would have preferred to say that in person and look the guy eye to eye, just as human beings, right? So I hope this is not the new normal, but I would say that I think maybe the idea of the conference call might have gone away, and maybe more teams are going to be looking to do Zooms as opposed to just the conference call. But I hope that eventually we're back in the buildings, we're back in the locker rooms, we're back in press conferences, we're back in scrums, and we really can, dig our heels in that way to do the reporting that the readers want, and get the information the readers want, and also just to have that relationship, the give and take with the sources out there. It's enjoyable, and B, I think it helps them too. They get an opportunity to get their point across in a better way when it's in person than when it's on Zoom.
Last question for you, Dan, and I always ask this to all my sports media guests, is what's one piece of advice that you would give to a young journalist or a writer looking to break into the industry, especially in such a challenging time right now for the whole business?
Yeah. No story is too small. There is no story that is too small, and treat every story that you get, every assignment, I should say, that you get if you're working in a newspaper, a website, radio, wherever it may be. Treat every assignment you get as if you're covering the Stanley Cup Final. Because if you treat it that way, you'll appreciate it and you'll do your best work with it. If you treat it as if it's just another little nothing thing, then it will look like just a little nothing thing.
Dan Rosen, he is a senior writer for NHL.com. Dan, I wish you all the best covering the rest of the Stanley Cup playoffs, and thanks so much for coming on the Weesports Chronicles.
All right, appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on.